I didn't expect the email. It landed in my inbox like a dropped match. A bright little flicker that could burn everything down if I let it. Subject line: Invitation to the Carson Tate Show. I clicked on it, expecting a prank or maybe some elaborate setup. But no, it was real. Dear Mr. Jameson, we'd love to invite you to be a guest on the Carson Tate Show to discuss your activism, racial issues in America, and your perspective on the state of equality today. Carson looks forward to an open and honest conversation. Please let us know your availability. Best, Stephanie Cole. Producer, The Carson Tate Show. I leaned back in my chair, rereading the email. Carson Tate. The name alone carried weight. A conservative firebrand with a reputation for pushing boundaries, stirring controversy, and, let's be real, undermining people like me. He wasn't just another TV host, he was a spectacle. The kind who played to his base, the kind who smiled while dismissing centuries of oppression as the past. This wasn't an invitation. It was a setup. My first instinct was to delete the email and move on. I knew how these things went. I'd seen too many activists get blindsided. Their words twisted. Their calmness turned into weakness or, worse, their frustration turned into a meme. Angry, unreasonable, impossible to take seriously. I could already see the headlines: Activist loses cool on national TV, or Carson Tate schools woke leftist. But then I thought about why they wanted me. I wasn't just another voice online screaming into the void. I had numbers, receipts, stories. I had been on the ground, marching, organizing, sitting in community meetings until midnight, listening to people who'd been overlooked for too long. Maybe they thought I was easy to rattle. Maybe they thought I'd stumble over my own words. They were wrong. I hit reply. Ms. Cole, I'd be happy to join Carson for this conversation. Let me know the details. Looking forward to it. Best, Malcolm Jameson. I hovered over the send button for a second, knowing what this meant. Once I pressed it, there was no turning back. Click. Game on. The day of the show came faster than I expected. When I arrived at the studio, the first thing I noticed was how cold it was. Not just the AC, though that was blasting too, but the energy. Everything felt manufactured, polished, controlled. The walls were lined with photos of Carson shaking hands with politicians, celebrities, people who'd sat in the same chair I was about to occupy. I could almost hear their voices, some laughing, some arguing, some caught in a trap they never saw coming. A production assistant, a young woman with a clipboard and a tight smile, guided me through the process. Mr. Jameson, great to have you here. Would you like water? No, thank you. All right, we'll get you mic'd up in a second. Carson will introduce you after the monologue. Just be yourself. I almost laughed at that. Be myself? Sure, that was the plan. They led me to a dressing room, a simple space with a mirror, a chair, and a bottle of water I wouldn't touch. I sat down, exhaled slowly, and checked my phone. No new messages. Then a knock. 5 minutes, Mr. Jameson. Showtime. I stepped onto the stage, the lights searing hot against my skin. The audience clapped. Not for me, not really, but because the applause sign told them to. Carson Tate sat across from me, leaning back in his chair like a king on his throne. He was exactly as he looked on TV. Crisp navy suit, hair slicked just right, a smirk that never quite left his face. The kind of man who didn't ask questions to learn. He asked to win. Malcolm Jameson, he said, flashing his practiced grin as I took my seat. Civil rights activist, community organizer, and, some might say, a professional troublemaker. A chuckle rippled through the audience. I smiled. I'll take that last one as a compliment. Welcome to the show, he said, folding his hands like a man settling in for a chess match. Glad you could make it. Glad to be here. A beat passed. Let's get right into it, shall we? Carson said. You've been very vocal about racism in America, systemic racism, as you call it. But many people, myself included, believe that racism today isn't what it used to be. This isn't the 1960s. We have black CEOs, a black vice president, even had a black president. Doesn't that prove we've moved past all this? There it was. The first move. Classic. I kept my face neutral. I think what it proves is that progress has been made. But progress doesn't mean the problem is gone. A disease doesn't disappear just because you lower the fever. Carson tilted his head, pretending to consider my words. All right, but isn't it possible that, at this point, racism is more of an individual issue than a systemic one? I mean, slavery ended over 150 years ago. Jim Crow has been dead for decades. At what point does personal responsibility take over? Another move. I saw where he was going. He wanted me to get defensive, wanted me to argue from emotion instead of facts. So I gave him what he didn't expect. Carson, let's talk about numbers. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. His eyes flicked to it, curious, maybe a little wary. Black Americans make up about 13% of the US population, right? He nodded. But we're nearly 40% of the prison population. Now, I know what some folks say, well, maybe they just commit more crimes. But let's look at drug use. Studies show black and white Americans use drugs at roughly the same rates. But black people are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for it. Carson opened his mouth, but I kept going. Or let's talk wealth. The median white household has 10 times the wealth of the median black household. Not because black people don't work hard, hell, we built this country, but because of policies that kept us from owning homes, getting loans, building generational wealth. Redlining, discriminatory lending, hiring bias. It all adds up. The audience had gone quiet. I met Carson's gaze. So when people say racism is an individual issue, my question is, how do you explain the patterns? Because individuals don't create patterns. Systems do. For the first time, Carson didn't immediately have a comeback. He adjusted his tie, his smile a little tighter now. Well, he said, chuckling, I think a lot of people would argue that those disparities have more to do with culture than racism. I leaned forward slightly. Culture? That's interesting. He nodded. Sure. Single-parent households, crime rates, personal choices. No one is stopping anyone from succeeding in this country. I nodded slowly, like I was really chewing on his words. Then I set the trap. Okay, let's go with that. Culture. If we're talking about crime, then explain why poor white communities with the same conditions, single-parent homes, job loss, underfunded schools, don't get the same level of policing, the same sentencing, the same criminal records. Carson's smirk twitched, but I wasn't done. If we're talking about personal choices, then why do studies show that a black college graduate still has a higher unemployment rate than a white high school dropout? Silence. I sat back. See, Carson, when people bring up culture and personal responsibility, what they're really doing is looking for a way to ignore the bigger picture. Because if the problem is culture, then it's not their problem. It's not America's problem. It's just our problem. And that's convenient, isn't it? The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Carson cleared his throat. Well, I think we need to take a break. I smiled. Sure, take your time. He turned to the camera. We'll be right back after this. The second the red light blinked off, a producer rushed up to him, whispering something in his ear. He didn't look at me. I stretched my fingers, exhaled, and waited for round 2. As the commercial break ticked by, I could feel the energy in the room shift. The audience wasn't as loose as before. Some looked thoughtful, others uncomfortable. Even Carson, usually smug and untouchable, was adjusting his suit jacket like it had suddenly shrunk. A producer gave him the countdown. 3 to 1. The cameras blinked back on, and Carson's practiced smile returned, though this time it had an edge to it. Welcome back, he said smoothly. We're here with activist Malcolm Jameson, discussing race and inequality in America. He turned toward me, his expression sharpening. Now, Malcolm, I hear what you're saying, I really do, but let's address something that's on a lot of people's minds. If systemic racism is as bad as you claim, why do so many immigrants of color come to America and succeed? Asians, for example, have a higher average income than white Americans. Doesn't that suggest that maybe the issue isn't racism, but how different communities approach opportunity? I almost smiled. Almost. I said. The model minority argument. I folded my hands, giving him the same polite patience he'd given me earlier. Let's break that down, because I think a lot of people don't understand the full picture. Carson gestured. By all means. First, let's talk about who gets to immigrate. America's immigration policies favor highly skilled workers, engineers, doctors, scientists. In other words, many of the people who come here legally from, say, China or India, are already part of the middle or upper class in their home countries. They aren't coming here as poor, struggling farmers. They're coming with degrees, connections, and resources. That's not the same playing field that Black Americans, whose families have been systematically denied those advantages for generations, are working with. Carson nodded, pretending to consider that. Okay, but what about personal responsibility? Plenty of Black immigrants, Nigerians for example, come to America and succeed. If racism is really such a barrier, wouldn't they be struggling just as much? Good question, I said, and I meant it. It was a question I'd heard before, one that made sense if you didn't look too deep. Let's think about this logically. When someone immigrates, they've already made a choice, a huge one. They've uprooted their lives, sometimes leaving everything behind, to chase opportunity. That kind of person is already self-selecting for ambition, for drive. And even then, Black immigrants do face discrimination just like Black Americans. But because they don't have the same generational baggage, redlining, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, they sometimes start from a slightly different position. That doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. It just means the variables aren't identical. Carson exhaled through his nose, clearly not loving my answer. All right, he said, shifting gears. But if racism is as widespread as you claim, why do we see so many successful Black people? Oprah, Barack Obama, Jay-Z. Doesn't that prove that success is possible, regardless of race? There it was. The old exception proves the rule tactic. I leaned in slightly. Carson, let's flip that logic for a second. If racism isn't a major barrier, then why is it that every time we talk about successful Black people, we name the same handful of people? You just mentioned Oprah, Obama, and Jay-Z. Why aren't there thousands of names rolling off your tongue? His lips pressed together, but I wasn't done. Let's take sports, I continued. Nobody argues that LeBron James is talented. Nobody says Serena Williams got lucky. But if a Black person wants to succeed in America, they have to be exceptional. An athlete, an entertainer, a once-in-a-generation genius. Meanwhile, an average white guy with a decent degree can land a solid job, buy a house in a nice neighborhood, and build wealth without being a superstar. That's the difference. Carson forced a laugh, shaking his head. I think you're being a little dramatic. Am I? I asked, my voice steady. Or are you just uncomfortable with the truth? The audience murmured. A woman in the front row nodded slightly, arms crossed. Carson sighed, playing exasperated. Look, I'm not saying racism never happens. Of course, there are bad apples. But the way you're talking, it's like America is designed to keep Black people down. I just don't buy that. I studied him for a second. Carson, do you believe in gravity? He blinked. What? Do you believe in gravity? I repeated. He scoffed. Obviously. Why? He frowned. Because it's real? Right? But you don't see gravity. You just see what it does. I paused, letting that sink in. Racism is the same way. You might not see it directly, but you see what it does. You see the wealth gaps, the incarceration rates, the hiring biases, the health disparities. That's gravity, Carson. You don't have to believe in it for it to be real. The audience was silent. Carson opened his mouth, then shut it. He glanced toward his producer. I could tell he wanted another break. Well, he finally said, forcing another tight smile. This is certainly an interesting conversation. When we come back, I want to ask Malcolm about solutions. If systemic racism is real, what can we do about it? The camera light blinked off. Another break. Another quiet audience. Carson stood, rolling his shoulders like a man preparing for a second round he didn't expect. His smirk was still there, but smaller now, like he was rethinking his strategy. I sat back in my chair, calm. I wasn't here to yell. I wasn't here to fight. I was here to tell the truth. And Carson Tate was running out of ways to deny it. Carson spent the entire break pretending to be at ease. He rolled his shoulders, sipped from a water bottle, even shared a quiet joke with a producer. But I could see it, the slight stiffness in his posture, the way his fingers tapped against his knee. He wasn't winning, and he knew it. I stayed still, hands folded, eyes steady. I come prepared for this moment. Carson had underestimated me. He thought I'd be just another guest he could rattle, someone who'd get flustered and defensive under the bright lights. Instead, he was the one shifting in his seat. The producer gave us the countdown. 3, 2, 1. The cameras went live, and Carson flashed his well-rehearsed smile. Welcome back, he said, his voice smooth, controlled. We've been having a spirited conversation with activist Malcolm Jameson about systemic racism in America. But I want to move past the debate and talk about solutions. He turned toward me. Malcolm, you've laid out a lot of problems, and I'll admit you make some strong points. But here's the question. What's the solution? If systemic racism exists, what should we do about it? I nodded. I've been waiting for this. That's a fair question, I said. But before we talk about solutions, let me ask you something, Carson. His eyebrows lifted slightly. All right, if someone breaks their leg, What's the first step? He blinked, caught off guard. I guess you'd go to the hospital. Exactly. You don't tell them to walk it off. You don't say, well, your other leg is fine, so stop complaining. You treat the injury. I let the words settle before continuing. America has a broken leg. The injury was caused by centuries of policies that excluded, exploited, and marginalized black people. But instead of treating the injury, people like you keep saying, well, we had a black president, so why are you still limping? The audience murmured. I saw heads nodding. Carson exhaled through his nose. Okay, but what specific policies do you think need to change? Glad you asked, I said. Let's start with voting rights. Studies show that states with large black populations tend to have more restrictive voting laws. Closing polling places, cutting early voting, purging voter rolls. That's not a coincidence. That's a strategy. Carson opened his mouth, but I kept going. Then there's education. Schools in predominantly black neighborhoods receive billions less in funding than majority white schools. And before you say, well, that's based on property taxes, that's the problem. Those neighborhoods were intentionally kept poor through redlining and discriminatory housing policies. So now their schools suffer. He leaned forward, searching for an opening. And let's talk criminal justice, I continued. Mandatory minimums, cash bail, over-policing, these aren't accidents. These are policies designed to keep certain communities trapped in cycles of poverty and incarceration. And you want to know the wildest part? Fixing these issues doesn't just help black people. It helps everyone. Carson frowned. What do you mean? I spread my hands. You fix the education system and suddenly poor white kids in underfunded rural schools get better opportunities too. You end predatory lending and suddenly working-class white families aren't drowning in debt. You reform criminal justice and suddenly fewer people, black and white, are stuck in a system that profits off mass incarceration. I shook my head. This isn't a black problem. This is an American problem. But America has a habit of only caring about an issue when it stops being a black issue first. Carson's jaw tightened. He felt the shift in the room. The audience wasn't just listening anymore. They were engaged. I leaned back, my voice steady. So when people ask, what's the solution? The real question is, are you actually willing to fix the problem? Because history shows that every time we get close, every time we talk about real change, there's always an excuse. Oh, that's too expensive. Oh, that's too radical. Oh, that's too divisive. I tilted my head. Funny how the cost is always too high when it's our healing, but never when it's our suffering. A beat of silence. Carson glanced toward his producer, then back at me. His smile was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched too tight. He shifted in his chair. Well, he said finally, I think a lot of people would argue that progress takes time. That change has to happen naturally. I nodded slowly. Tell me something, Carson. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, do you think that happened because people waited for things to change naturally? He didn't answer. Did desegregation happen because people sat back and said, give it a few decades? Still nothing. No. Change happened because people fought for it. Because they refused to accept the idea that justice should be convenient for the people in power. I exhaled, then looked him in the eye. So tell me, Carson, are you saying black people should just sit and wait for another 50 years? Another 100? Or are you finally willing to admit that the only reason you're uncomfortable is because deep down, you know the system isn't broken? It's working exactly the way it was designed. Silence. Not just from Carson. From the audience. No murmurs. No nervous laughter. Just quiet. I saw it then, the flicker in Carson's eyes. The realization that this wasn't going the way he planned. That he wasn't controlling the conversation anymore. And that's when I knew. This clip was going to go viral. The silence stretched. Thick. Heavy. The kind that makes people shift in their seats. Clear their throats. Pretend they're not thinking what they're thinking. Carson didn't like silence. His brand was built on control. On quick retorts, sharp comebacks. Steering the conversation like a man guiding a horse with a firm hand. But right now, he had nothing. And he knew it. His fingers tapped against his armrest. He glanced toward his producer, but she wasn't meeting his eyes. She was watching me. The audience was watching me. I waited. Let him stew in it. Let him feel it. Then he exhaled through his nose, forcing another smile. All right? He said, sitting up straighter, gripping the desk like it could anchor him. You've made your points, Malcolm, but I want to ask you something directly, because I think it's important. Do you believe America is a racist country? The audience held its breath. A loaded question, the kind designed to trip me up. If I said yes, I'd be painted as ungrateful, a radical, someone who hates America. If I said no, I'd be letting him off the hook. I smiled. Let me ask you something, Carson. If a house has a leaking roof, bad plumbing, and the foundation is cracked, does that mean the house itself is bad? Or does it mean it needs fixing? His brow furrowed slightly, but I didn't let him interrupt. America isn't a bad country, I continued, but it is a country built on contradictions. All men are created equal was written by men who owned slaves. The land of opportunity was built on stolen land. We praise freedom, but built the largest prison system in the world. The problem isn't that America is inherently racist. The problem is that America has never been willing to fully confront the racism woven into its foundation. I leaned in slightly. So to answer your question, America isn't just racist. It's complicated. It's flawed. And like any flawed thing, it can be fixed, if people are actually willing to fix it. A ripple of reaction from the crowd. Some murmurs. A few nods. Carson exhaled, his jaw tight. I could see it in his face. He wanted to dismiss me. Wanted to turn this into a debate, a shouting match. That was how he won. By making things messy. By making sure his audience could write me off as just another angry activist. But I wasn't giving him that. So he did what people like him always do when they're cornered. He laughed. A low, casual chuckle. Shaking his head like I was a child saying something ridiculous at the dinner table. Look, Malcolm, he said, spreading his hands. I hear what you're saying, but I think a lot of people watching right now would say, hey, if you don't like America, why not just leave? I smiled. Not the polite kind. The kind that said, oh, you just made a mistake. Funny you say that, I replied, because that's exactly what people told my ancestors when they were brought here in chains. The room went dead silent. Carson's smirk froze. I let the words settle. Let them sit in the air. Let the weight of them sink into every person in the audience. Then calmly I continued. See, that's the thing. When black people protest injustice, we're told to leave. But when white Americans didn't like British rule, they started a whole revolution. No one told them to leave. No one told the founding fathers to just deal with it when they had grievances. But when we speak up, suddenly, we're the problem. I shook my head. Nah, that's not how this works. If we can build this country, we sure as hell have the right to fix it. The audience didn't just murmur now. They reacted. A few gasps, a couple of claps. One or two scattered hums from the back rows. Carson's face was carefully neutral, but I could see the shift in his eyes. He was losing them. He knew it. I knew it. And worst of all, so did the cameras. Carson Tate was drowning. He tried to hide it, smoothing his tie, glancing toward the producer, forcing that tight, plastic smile, but he wasn't fooling anyone. Not me. Not the audience. Not even himself. He had lost control of the conversation. And worse, he had lost them. The audience. His people. His brand was built on dominance, on flipping the script, catching his guests off guard, making them stammer and fold under pressure. But this time, he was the one struggling for footing. The cameras were rolling. Every second of silence, every flicker of hesitation, was being recorded, edited, clipped, ready to be blasted across every social media platform by morning. He had one last chance, one last move, a deep breath, then the pivot. All right, Malcolm, he said, shifting gears, voice measured. You're obviously passionate about these issues, and I respect that. A lie, but a smooth one. But I think a lot of Americans, black, white, whatever, are just tired of talking about race. They want unity. They want to move forward. Wouldn't focusing so much on the past just keep us stuck in it? The unity card. The let's move forward card. A desperate move, but I was ready. I leaned back, exhaled slowly. Then I spoke. Carson, imagine you're in a car accident. You're hurt badly. You go to the hospital and the doctor walks in. But instead of treating you, he just says, hey, let's not focus on the accident. Let's just move forward. I let it sink in. Would that make sense? Carson didn't answer. I nodded. That's what people are asking us to do. To ignore the damage, to move on without healing, without accountability, without fixing the systems that caused the harm in the first place. I gestured to the crowd. And the funny thing? Whenever we do try to fix things, through protests, policies, conversations like this, people say, why are you making everything about race? I tilted my head. Well, maybe because everything has been about race from the start. We didn't choose that. We just refuse to pretend it's not there. Silence. Carson sat still, jaw tight. He glanced toward the producer again, but she didn't give him an out. The audience wasn't chuckling along with him anymore. The energy had shifted. He had lost, and I wasn't going to let him forget it. I leaned forward, looking him dead in the eye. My voice calm, controlled. You asked earlier if America is a racist country, and I told you, America is complicated. It has contradictions. But you want to know the real question, Carson? I paused. Then the final blow. Is America willing to be honest about itself? Silence. Thick, uncomfortable. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just another interview. This was history. The clip exploded online. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Millions of views, thousands of comments. People dissecting every second. The silence. The expressions. The shift. Malcolm Jameson ends Carson Tate's career in 10 minutes. Watch Carson Tate's face when he realizes he lost. This clip will be studied in schools one day. Some of Carson's usual crowd tried to defend him, but the damage was done. Even his own viewers saw it. He wasn't the sharp, unshakable host they were used to. He was rattled, exposed. The network issued a statement. A productive conversation, they called it. But insiders leaked reports that producers were furious. That Carson was furious. That behind the scenes, he was blaming everyone but himself. And me? I just went home. Didn't respond to the media requests. Didn't engage in the online debates. I let the clip speak for itself. Because the truth had already done what it always does. It spoke. And this time, people listened. If the story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.